Hi there, Pastor Johnson here. Welcome to the Generalist Pastor Podcast. We're going through a study on the Gospel of John, and today we're going to be finishing up John chapter 5. It's been a bit of a slog through much of the kind of technical language that Jesus has used here in his first interaction with the Pharisees and the detractors of his ministry, but we'll finish that up and we'll move on to another sign of Jesus here in the beginning of John chapter 6. So let's dive in, shall we? Now, Jesus here is in the middle of a conversation again with the Pharisees, these detractors who have said that he is not doing God's will in terms of how he has brought healing, particularly in a time that was not allowed in their minds. And so Jesus ends with this scathing rebuke. But I know you do not have the love of God within you. Now, when we think of this, we might just hear the religiosity of the language and not have anything kind of concrete here to lay our hope or our hats on, so to speak. You do not have the love of God. The hesed in Hebrew is what Jesus is referring to here, and that is the covenantal love and faithfulness of God that he promises to show to his people. In a New Testament church setting, in this new ecclesia in which we have, this would be more akin to saying you are outside of God's salvation. Right? You're no longer part of the people of God. You are not redeemed by God, but rather you are, well, in the words of the Old Testament, you are a goyim. You are part of the nations, not part of the people of God. So here Jesus is very stark, and if there were rabbis that heard this, they would most certainly have understood exactly what he is saying. Certainly the Pharisees among them understood exactly what Christ is saying, is that they are not part of the people of God. Now 43, I have come in my Father's name, and you do not receive me. If another comes in his own name, you will receive him. They don't receive him because he comes in his Father's name. They think they know the Old Testament. They think they know the love of God, but here is the love of God, now made manifest in the person and work of our Lord Jesus Christ, and they do not receive that. Therefore, they do not have the love of God. Therefore, they are not a part of God's people. Therefore, they are not being saved because of it. You can kind of see how that logical, rational, trend line goes. But if another comes in his own name, you will receive him. Why? And what does Jesus mean here? Well, another who comes in his own name, saying, I'm a big deal. No, they are not playing off of the Old Testament, and Jesus here is just again scathing his opponents, that if somebody comes claiming not to be from God, but rather to have their own authority, well, they'll believe them. Why? Because they don't have wisdom and they don't have understanding, because both of those come from God and from his love. As Paul says, Christ is the very power and wisdom of God. So apart from Christ, the Word, there can be no wisdom and there can be no discernment, and therefore they will follow after false teachers, which is a warning that the New Testament gives to us as well. And how is it that we are to defend ourselves against false teachings, whether they be in other denominations, whether they be in heretical groups such as the Word of Faith movement or other things of that nature? It comes from being in the Word, and the Word, more importantly, being in us, that His Spirit would motivate us and enlighten us and cause us to know and remember all things. So, verse 44, Jesus again scathing of his opponents. How can you believe? That is trust, ultimately. I mean, it's knowing trust. When you receive glory from one another and do not seek the glory that comes only from God. So they are looking to trust in their outward actions. This is part and parcel for both ancient and contemporary Judaism. is that one is focused upon the works, not upon the heart. It's not about the intent, but rather about the outcome. There's certainly been some scandals in the last couple of years with various prominent Jewish teachers coming out explicitly in favor of, um, we would say, sin. Um, but it would be a sin of a mind, sin of the mind or of the heart, not necessarily a sin of the body. And so uh, you can Google all of that. I don't need to drag us through the mud here. What suffices is this: how can you believe when you receive glory from one another that is for your deeds, but you do not seek the glory that comes only from God? Because only God's glory is righteous, right? We can try and be good and right in front of each other. And there is certainly a horizontal aspect to righteousness. That is how I appear before my neighbor, my status as a citizen, my worth in a community. That's all well and good, but that has no bearing on my salvific stance. It has no bearing on my vertical righteousness. Only God's glory, God's righteousness can make me right with God, and that does not come from my own works, as Christ clearly shows us, but rather from the work of the love of God, the love that has come now manifested before them in the person of Jesus, manifested for us in the historic faith in the person of Jesus, who has lived, died, and risen from the grave for our salvation. Now, Jesus goes on here, and this is a strange thing for him to say at first in verse 45. Do not think that I will accuse you to the Father. There is a lot in that phrase. Do not think that I will accuse you to the Father. Jesus comes as our mediator, the one who is the defender of his people to the Father. For the Father stands in justice. The same God who judges is the God who redeems. And so the Father stands certainly in judgment over sin. But in terms of the historic understanding of the Old Testament, what the Jews would look at, I mean, what is the role of Satan in the court of the Most High? Well, Satana means accuser. Jesus himself says in Mark, I believe it's Mark chapter 4, that he has seen the accuser of our brethren has been thrown down. Right? So Jesus here is addressing certainly what's on their hearts, and will come out in various places within the Gospels, that the accusation that Jesus is casting out demons by the prince of demons. Here Jesus subtly destroys that argument, saying, I'm not going to accuse you before the Father. That's not my job. That's Satan's job to reveal that sin before the Father, for the Father is just and will judge sin. And then he says and turns the tables again on the Pharisees and saying, there is already one who accuses you, and it's not the devil, it's Moses on whom you have set your hope. Because the Pharisees have set their hope on being right according to the law. And so Jesus highlights Moses as the one who gave the law, who brought the law down, from Sinai. And so Moses sits in judgment. This is a way of saying things. Moses, I don't believe in terms of the salvific understanding of the whole world, is kind of sitting in judgment over people, but this is what we might call a metonymy, using Moses one thing and describing a whole set of things through it. And so Moses is the one who brought the law. The law is that which accuses because it shows us our sin. Therefore, Moses is the one who accuses. All right. I think we've beaten that little piece there enough. Verse 46, for if you believe Moses, you would believe me. Here again, if you want justification by the law, you got to do all the law. And you got to do it in the fullness of what the law intends, not just the outward appearance of the law, not just the literal sense of it, not that superficial, simple reading alone, but in the depth of it, as Christ shows us in the Sermon on the Mount, where he highlights for us that you have heard it said, but I say unto you. You've heard it said, do not kill. Well, it's not only just do not kill, but it is speaking to the internal state of the individual in which hate, not love, rules and reigns. So, if you would believe Moses, you would believe me, for he wrote of me. Well, when did Moses write of Jesus? Well, certainly every word of the Old Testament points us to Christ, but Moses explicitly says that right before he dies, that the Lord would send another prophet, one who is greater than him. And that's whom Jesus is claiming to be, the one who has come to fulfill, not destroy, but fulfill the law, and therefore be a greater Moses than the one who simply brought the law but was unable to keep it himself. Jesus is able to keep the law and fulfill it in its total. 47. But if you do not believe his writings, how will you believe my words? So again, Jesus here, total condemnation of the Pharisees. If you don't believe his words, that his promise there would be one who is to come, how can you believe my words that I am that guy? Again, those who are hearing Jesus are going to say, well, we do believe Moses, but we don't believe you're the guy. And Jesus then would say, well, what proof do you have of that? Because I do the signs and wonders even more so than Moses. I am fulfilling the law. I am keeping it in its literal and even more so in its spiritual sense. There's not a lot that one can point to show how Christ would not be the greater Moses. But because he has offended them so, and so often this happens to all of us, as well as that when we are offended, we cannot see the truth of things because our anger, our wrath, it clouds our vision and we are blind. And so as Christ condemns in other places, it is the blind leading the blind. Why? Because of their wrath, because of their anger towards Christ and what he stands and has done. Okay. So that brings us to the end of chapter 5. Whew, finally. We're about a quarter of the way through the Gospel of John. Only a few more months of this. I hope that you have found this to be good and edifying over this time. If you have, please make sure to subscribe to the blog, share it with friends, and certainly let me know at church that you are watching, you are listening, you are going along with us each week. And if you'd like more of these, whether they be digitally or you want some more in-person Bible study options, let's find some times. There is nothing greater of a joy for me than to teach the word of the Lord to his people. So chapter 6 now begins in this way. After this, Jesus went away to the other side of the Sea of Galilee, which is the Sea of Tiberias. Here, John is letting his readers know that there is both Jewish names and Latin Roman names for the region. So John's gospel is written by tradition within the city of Ephesus. It's the last book that John writes. And so they would know somewhat of the land of Palestine, particularly as that Jewish community is the first group to become Christians. But Ephesus is a long way away, weeks of travel. And so they may not know of the Sea of Galilee, but they may absolutely know of the Sea of Tiberias, because Tiberius is an emperor and would, kind of geography that gives glory and homage to him would have been far more common to be known. All right, so there's our kind of 2 bits on history there. But what this tells us is that if you forgot, Jesus did kind of this ministry in chapter 5, right? Let's go all the way back here, and we can set again, where are we? Well, he is, breaking the Sabbath. Where is he breaking the Sabbath, right? Well, here he is in Jerusalem, okay? All the way back at the very beginning, we saw that he was breaking the Sabbath in Jerusalem. So what happens here, right? We go through all that red text, and now after Jesus went away to the other side of the Sea of Galilee, that's like the other side of the world in terms of the nation state of Israel. Okay, just hear me out here, just so you can kind of get an idea. It's certainly not as vast a distance as I'm about to highlight for you, but this would be like starting in New York City for us. All right, Jesus, in Jerusalem, it's like New York City. And then after he has this argument, he flies all the way across the country and goes to Seattle and begins to do things over there. All right, this is a huge, huge distance and division of where he was. Now, in reality, you know, it's only it's a couple of days journeys walk certainly, but John here doesn't give us any of that intermediate material. Simply, look, he had this argument, he had it out with them, and now Jesus has moved to the other side of the Sea of Galilee. He's gone all the way north. In fact, he's gone so far north, he's actually crossed over the other side of the Sea of Galilee. He's crossed over to a Gentile region. He's actually left Israel. And so it is there as he is kind of, went to this, he hasn't left Israel proper, but kind of this is the Gentile region in which there are both Jews and Gentiles. And so there he is, kind of gone all the way to the other side of the world, left behind those detractors. And now we'll see that when there aren't detractors immediately prevalent, what will we see? Well, we're going to see more signs and wonders. So, verse 2, a large crowd was following him. Again, we don't know how far. Was this a week later? Was this a month later? Is this like 3 months later? John writes in circles. You know this if you've read the book of Revelation. And if you've read it properly, you understand that there are several cycles that are happening kind of simultaneously. They're not one after another, but they're kind of simultaneously happening within history. Same thing with the Gospel of John, just his style in thinking. So Jesus went up. A large crowd is following him. They saw the signs that he was doing on the sick, right? He's healing the sick. He's being the guy that he was being before. The same thing that got him into trouble is now in Jerusalem, is now in this kind of country bumpkin-esque area, is bringing about a following. Those who are not of the intellectual elite, well, they can see Jesus for who he is, this greater Moses, this one who brings healing and hope. And so Jesus went up on a mountain, and there he sat down with his disciples. Now, whenever you see Jesus going up on a mountain, we ought to think of things in a more spiritual sense. We ought to expect spiritual things to be happening. And when Jesus sits down, this is a sign of authority. Today, we have the opposite. You think about a classroom. What do? Children sit, professors stand. Why? Because in our culture, the one who is standing is the one who is running the show. It has the authority. And that's because chairs are prevalent. Sitting is common. In the ancient world, it took a lot to make a chair. It took a lot to bring seating, especially to a large group. And so the chair was reserved, right, for those who had worthy things to be heard, so that they could continue with the work that they were doing, the important work, which was talking and teaching. And everybody else stood or sat on the ground because they wanted to receive that work. All right, so that's what Jesus does here. He takes on this position of authority by sitting. Very much counter our culture. Verse 4. Now, the Passover, the feast of the Jews, was at hand. Well, I thought we were just dealing with the Passover, right? Is this homage to tell us that, Jesus is it's still the week of the Passover? He had been in Jerusalem, now he flees Jerusalem, or is this the next year? We simply aren't sure. Scholars will debate this even to this day. Nevertheless, it's an important feature of this text to tell us that the Passover, the Feast of the Jews, was at hand. Again, we are in a mixed area, Jew and Gentile area, and it anticipates then not only God feeding his people, but that God would provide for them against death with life. And so whenever we see kind of the Passover, particularly in the New Testament, we ought to be looking for some of those themes, for themes of death and life, for themes of God's redemption, for themes of God's provisional care of his people. And so as that is going on and Jesus sits down, he's going to teach, and whatever he's about to do should kind of clue in on all of those themes. All right, we're going to end here at verse 5. We'll pick up at verse 5 next time. Thank you so much for being here. I look forward to talking with you next time and going through some of one of the coolest and widely known miracles of Jesus, and another sign as we continue on in this book of signs in John's Gospel. The Lord bless and keep you. Bye bye.